Jean Lambert, Green Party politician and former member of European Parliament. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I want to start with general election, which is going to take place on 12 December in UK. A lot of people argue it is a kind of second Brexit referendum. What are your thoughts about that? Do they right?
I think to some extent it is a second Brexit referendum, but it's also more complicated than that, because of course a general election is also about public services, the National Health Service, a whole range of other things. And therefore I think if you look at it only as a Brexit referendum, you run the risk of, sort of compressing people's views only into that. And this is always the danger, I think, for British politics, where people come out of an election and the government will say, we have a mandate for whatever, you know? And that isn't necessarily the real reason why people have voted as they have done.
And how Green Party is doing in the campaigning?
Well, for the Green Party, general elections are always very difficult because of our electoral system. So we're really concentrating on a small number of seats in terms of being able to possibly win them. Obviously we want to keep the one seat that we have with Caroline Lucas in Brighton. There are two others that we think are realistic, one in Bristol, one on the Isle of Wight. But also what we're asking people to do is, in places where they feel they can, to really vote for the Greens, because we also want this to be an election about climate and climate change, because while Brexit, yes, is enormously important for the UK, climate change is the really big issue for the world. And therefore, we need to have a result from this election that also says people care about that, and whoever the government is, they want the government to take action.
And UK held the Brexit referendum in 2016, and now we are in the end of 2019. And why it's been so difficult process about Brexit? Why they are stuck?
I think partly because the result was so close, 52-48% roughly. So you can't argue that there was a clear view. Also, I think the British political system works on the basis of if you're not the government, you're the opposition. So it's very difficult for parties in the UK to be seen to work together constructively at the national level. And I think that if Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, had actually said to the House of Commons, we need time to process this, we need to set up a system to look at what does this mean, what do we think the possible outcomes will be, can we find a consensus, or at least a secure majority in the Parliament, would have been much better than a general election which then gave her no clear majority at all, and also which cut out other political parties from really being a part of deciding what does this mean for the UK. And her sort of key lines about free movement, being out of the Court of Justice, all of these things were very much from her as a Home Office minister, I think. So, and once you began to see that the Leave campaign, there have been court judgments against it, effectively for misuse of data, for cheating. People then begin to think, well, okay, was this really what we wanted? So it's not surprising. And it's also, it's 40 years of politics that have been bound up with the European Union. You can't come out of that overnight,
The same for both sides, actually, for European Union and for UK, and which they haven't experienced anything like that before. That's why it looks like it will be even more difficult. So let's say after the election, whatever the results is, if UK, the government, British government, decide to leave the European Union, which is likely is going to be, what kind of effects is going to have on Britain and on EU itself, on both sides?
Well, I think that the likely effect, if we do leave, we're only just beginning to work out what those might be. There's the internal sort of constitutional problems there will then be for the UK about what is the future of Northern Ireland, whether the Scottish get a second referendum on independence. So are we actually going to be looking in 10 years' time at the United Kingdom as it is now, even just in its, the countries that make it up? I think in terms of our trading relationships, it's the government at the moment seem to me to want two things. They want things to be the same as they are now on environment, workers' rights, these sort of things that they talk about. And yet they talk to the Americans about a free trade deal where we know that we know from the experience at the European Union level that one of the things that the Americans will want will be opening up our agricultural markets and changing our standards. So there's a big question there for the UK about what it will be. For the European Union, also, I think it's difficult to look at what the relationships will be. They will want to continue to find some way to continue relationships on security matters, not only on trade. And therefore, they're really going to have to be doing, I think, it's going to take a lot of time and energy to work out quite how that will work, without making it look as if the UK gets special privileges as a leave nation. I think we're just at the beginning of the problems.
And UK government has been their reaction has been very invisible against Turkey, their human rights violation and invasion of Syria. Do you think there is any link with that? Because UK sees Turkey as a new market after Brexit.
I think this government has been very quiet on a lot of international issues and human rights issues which should have been much stronger. And if we want to be this strong world power that Boris Johnson keeps talking about, you can't do that by staying silent. But I think there is an element, you're quite right, about if the UK is looking at new markets and they want to develop our market with Turkey, they want to develop our market with India, for example, various other countries, you're seeing the government being much quieter than it should be on some of the things that are going on, whether that's Kashmir or, of course, Syria. And we got a bit of a reaction, maybe on arms sales to Turkey, but I think also, of course, this is setting up some really big problems in NATO about what do we do with Turkey as part of NATO, when Turkey is also being that much closer these days to the Russians. I think the government does not have a clear view on where it should be positioning itself internationally, and I think this is, I think it's a shame in many ways, not least because they should be speaking out on human rights violations. Of course they should.
And from that coming to EU reaction against the same topic, last year when they attacked Afrin and when they invaded Afrin, you were still in the parliament. So even now you're watching it closely. So how would you describe the reaction EU reaction against Turkish invasion in northern Syria?
I think it's got stronger recently. That there was a very clear resolution from the European Parliament calling for an end to arms sales to Turkey at the moment, for example, and I think that's got stronger in the European Parliament. For the European Union itself, of course, part of it is that its foreign policy statements, they need agreement amongst all the member states to really be as strong as they could be, and there are differences on Turkey between different member states. Also, of course, because the European Union has had this understanding with Turkey about the refugee situation.
Which Turkey has been threatening.
And so Turkey basically, yeah, absolutely, Turkey turns around and says, well, you know, if you object to what we're doing with our so-called buffer zone, well, you know, we'll just, as it were, turn on the tap and send the refugees through to you.
They don't hide it, they say it clearly.
They say it very, very clearly, and the European Union doesn't have a clear response to that. We know that there's big differences between different governments about how to handle that situation, where you've had Germany being much more open, Germany and Sweden, for example, being much more open than obviously countries like Hungary and Poland, who have been absolutely shocking in their response to it. So, you know, I think there is a real problem going on there with the European Union and its foreign policy and its human rights policy. Also, of course, the question too about there being the background issues about Turkish accession to the European Union. So that has also begun to play into this. And I just think it's been appalling to watch what has been happening there, where, I mean, obviously the major responsibility for the recent events lies with Donald Trump, effectively giving a green light to Turkey to move in to Syria. But that to not see a really strong, united response, you know, from European Union member states, I think is really distressing. Particularly when so many countries also know you know, what the Kurdish people have done to fight back the forces of Daesh, and then to turn around and say, oh well, thank you, but you know, we don't really know what to do now, is awful, really, really awful.
And while Erdogan and Turkish state blackmailing EU about refugees, with that buffer zone they are claiming, they have made like hundreds of thousands of people to flee their houses, and they create another crisis of refugees, don't you think?
They create another crisis of refugees. They create another crisis of government. You know, for example, in Iraq, if that's where people are moving to, wherever people are moving to, it's a destabilizing factor there. And you know, the last thing this world needs is to be creating more refugees. You know, and that if a government cannot find a way to, you know, manage things politically, but feels it needs to have this sort of military reaction, I mean, we know what it's about. This is basically about the Turkish state saying to the Kurdish people, any idea you have about any greater autonomy, you know, we are not permitting that. And we are making clear that we are not allowing successful Kurdish-run governments, even, you know, in parts of other countries, you know, we have to crush this. We have to crush this. And I think that, you know, NATO over the years has been really weak and has given far too much ground to Turkey, you know, and has not stood up for the people that have actually supported, as it were, you know, has supported international human rights values on the ground.
You know, Kurds feel sometimes that international law doesn't apply when it comes to them. You know, what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Syria. So do you think they are wrong with feeling like that international law doesn't apply to them?
I think it's very understandable why they think that. And I think partly because international law is very much based on, you know, national governments, and therefore, you know, and the sort of the primary role of national government. And therefore, if you have a problem within your own country, other countries are very reluctant often to get involved within that. So I can well understand why the Kurdish people feel that international law is not being properly applied to them. But I think that when you're looking now at the situation in Syria, the actions of the Turkish government, is very clear, that this is cross-border, and that people, to the grounds for action by Turkey, I think, are really weak, and that the international community should be standing up on that. But, of course, we then have the problem with the United Nations Security Council about quite where Russia sits within all of this as well. And, of course, it's one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to tackle anything with Syria, because of Russian engagement. And so, from my political perspective, my party's perspective, this is one of the reasons why we think we need to be looking at how do you change the role of the Security Council.
Jean Lambert, you've been a member of European Parliament for nearly 20 years. And it's like Turkey is one of the candidates during that time. So how has your experience been when Turkey was on the table?
Well, it's been interesting watching this over the years, and I mean, one of the reasons that I first got involved, I think, with the Kurdish community in the UK was because of this question about Turkish accession. And I wanted to talk with people from the Kurdish community about how they felt about whether Turkey should be seen as a possible member of the European Union. And, some years ago, I think the feeling was that it would be important to open that door for Turkey because of the changes that would have to come in democracy, in human rights, in particular, I mean, other things as well, but as part of that membership process. And I think, that there was a time when that looked difficult, but then you began to see progress. And you were thinking, good, this is good for people everywhere if democracy and human rights are improving. And then, of course, you get this, I think, an issue at the European level with certain of the national governments, for example, the French government, who began to make more of additional conditions about Turkish membership. And instead of it being the initial sort of set of gradually taking on board European Union law and coming into line in that way, started to add conditions, not least about recognition of the Armenian genocide, and issues which had never been part of that first discussion. So you began to feel that barriers were being put in the way of Turkish accession, and that some countries really didn't want to agree. They were very worried, I think, about having a country with such a large population, and such a large population where many were Muslim. And to be honest, that's part of the concern, even though Turkey's a secular state. So you were beginning to see these, and then of course you begin to see a reaction from Turkey about, look, if you're not playing fair with us, why should we move? And so I think we got to the point where thinking that things were moving, that progress was possible, that things were coming closer, governments were coming closer together, people were coming closer together, you then began to see barriers being put in the way. And this is why we are now in this really bad situation where even my political group, that has always been very open to Turkish accession, has agreed that we need to freeze the accession talks because the human rights situation in Turkey is now so dreadful.
So in this case, how do you see the future of Turkey in the European Union?
I think currently the situation of Turkey in the European Union is very difficult. I think the fact that the Turkish government now have imprisoned so many people from the political opposition, lawyers, teachers, journalists, academics, that this whole sort of crushing of democratic resistance you know, makes it very, very difficult to make a strong case for Turkey's accession in the current situation. And it's not until, you know, you begin to see, I think, things improving and opening up on democracy and human rights that those talks could be reopened. And then you've got the difficulties of countries like Hungary, and I think still France, frankly, about whether they would ever genuinely want to see Turkey as a member of the European Union.
Lastly, when we come to Kurdish question, both for like in Syria and in Turkey, how the international powers such as EU or United Nations can contribute to the solution?
Well, I think we've begun to see sort of changes from the European Union side, and you know, it may sound insignificant, but of course there's the annual report on Turkey that the European Parliament does. And we've at least begun to move to a situation where you could have a paragraph in that directly referred to the Kurdish people, rather than the situation in the southeast of the country. So, you know, Parliament had begun to move to recognise that, yes, there was a big issue about Kurdish treatment of the Kurdish people, possibility of Kurdish autonomy, the need for a peace process. So I think, you know, you've begun to see sort of a development in the Parliament. And I would really hope that that stays within the new Parliament, whether the UK is there or not, because, you know, this is obviously relevant. There's a lot of support from members from Sweden, from Germany, and others. So I really hope that this continues in the new Parliament, that openness and the engagement of Kurdish people with the European Parliament. That's been really important. I think there's still much more of a job to be done with national governments. But I think that the recent sort of Turkish incursion across the border into Syria, I think has also ironically opened up an opportunity to make a case for the Kurdish people being taken much more into account in relations with Turkey. Because the international community, I think, recognises the contribution, obviously, the amazing resistance from the Kurds, you know, to Daesh. And it's been an opportunity to talk about the political developments and the sort of the values as well through government that's come from the, you know, Kurdish community. So I think that has been and is still an opening through really terrible circumstances, but it's an opening to talk about the importance of the recognition of the Kurdish people, you know, and the need for them to be part of whatever the negotiations are about future peace, if that's possible, within Syria, and part of the negotiation about what happens with our relations with Turkey.
Jean Lambert, thank you very much for being with us and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.